At the beginning of the 20th century, Portugal existed in a state of quiet delay, suspended between the weight of its past and the slow, uneven arrival of modernity. While other parts of Europe were experiencing rapid industrial growth, urban expansion, and political transformation, much of Portugal remained deeply rural, deeply traditional, and deeply resistant to change. In the interior regions of the country, far from the coastal cities and centres of power, life followed rhythms that had remained largely untouched for generations. In these regions, time was not measured by clocks or schedules, but by seasons, harvests, and religious calendars. The land dictated daily life. The church structured the year. Birth, work, suffering, and death were understood through a religious lens that left little room for doubt or abstraction. Faith was not an intellectual position. It was the air people breathed. It shaped how the world was explained, how misfortune was interpreted, and how hope was sustained. One such place was the small village of Aljustrel, near Fatima. Isolated, modest, and almost invisible to the outside world, Aljustrel represented thousands of similar villages scattered across the Portuguese countryside. There were no factories, no schools beyond the most basic level, no newspapers shaping public opinion. News arrived slowly, filtered through rumour, sermons, and word of mouth. The church bell was the loudest voice in the village. Its sound regulated prayer, work, rest, and memory. It was here, in 1907, that Lúcia dos Santos was born. Her birth did not attract attention. It did not signal anything unusual. She was one more child in a large rural family, born into a world where individual destiny was expected to mirror that of countless others before her. Childhood was brief. Work came early. Obedience was assumed. Dreams were small, practical, and constrained by necessity. Lúcia was the youngest of several siblings. Her family lived with material scarcity, as most families in Aljustrel did. There was little margin for comfort. Daily survival depended on labour, cooperation, and discipline. From a very young age, children were expected to contribute. Herding animals, assisting with household chores, and learning responsibility were not optional stages of growth. They were requirements. Religion permeated every aspect of this life. Prayer accompanied meals, mornings, evenings, and sleep. Religious images filled homes. Saints were spoken of as if they were distant relatives, rather than historical figures. Heaven and hell were not metaphors, they were destinations. Sin was not psychological, it was dangerous. Salvation was urgent, fragile, and constantly at risk. Lúcia's mother, Maria Rosa, embodied this religious severity. Known for her strict devotion, she demanded moral discipline and absolute respect for religious practice. The rosary was recited daily, without exception. Disobedience was corrected firmly, for Maria Rosa faith was not meant to comfort. It was meant to discipline, to restrain, and to guide behaviour through fear, sacrifice, and submission to divine will. Her father, Antonio dos Santos, represented a quieter form of tradition. Less severe, less vocal, but still deeply embedded in the same worldview. He worked the land, respected religious customs, and accepted the authority of the church as a natural and unquestionable part of existence. Between her mother's rigid piety and her father's pragmatic silence, Lúcia grew up in an environment where questioning was neither encouraged nor expected. Much of Lúcia's life took place indoors. Like many children in the village, she worked as a shepherd. The countryside was her classroom, her playground, and her universe. Hills, caves, dirt paths, and open fields formed a closed world where imagination could expand freely. Long hours of solitude were filled with prayer, storytelling, and shared beliefs passed down through generations. Among the children who accompanied were her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto. Together, they formed a small, tightly bound group shaped by routine, family ties, and shared religious imagination. In this environment, stories of saints, angels, miracles, and divine punishment were not extraordinary. They were expected. The boundary between the spiritual and the real was thin, flexible, and easily crossed in the mind of a child From an early age, Lúcia displayed characteristics that distinguished her from the others. Later descriptions emphasize her ability to speak, organize, and lead. She took initiative in games and conversations. She explained rules, mediated disputes, and guided the group. While Francisco and Jacinta were often described as quiet and introspective, Lúcia stood out for her verbal confidence and narrative ability. This trait would later become decisive. When events occurred that required explanation, it was Lúcia who spoke. It was her voice that shaped the story. Her testimony became the primary source through which the events of Fatima were recorded, transmitted, and interpreted. Understanding this aspect of her personality is essential. Because it highlights a fundamental reality, narratives are not neutral. They are constructed, remembered, and communicated by specific individuals within specific contexts. To fully understand Lúcia's story, it is necessary to widen the lens and consider the broader historical environment in which she was growing up. In 1910, Portugal underwent a dramatic political transformation. The monarchy was overthrown and a republic was established. This new regime adopted a strong anti-clerical position. Religious orders were expelled. Church properties were confiscated. Public expressions of Catholicism were restricted and, in some cases, openly persecuted. For urban elites, this represented progress. For rural communities, it felt like an attack. The Church had long been the central institution organizing social life. Its sudden marginalization created fear, tension, and resentment. In villages like Aljustrel, faith became more than spiritual belief. It became cultural resistance. Holding on to religious practices was a way of defending identity against external forces that were perceived as hostile and destabilizing. Children absorbed this tension indirectly through conversations at home, sermons at church, and collective attitudes. They learned that faith was under threat. Belief was reinforced not only by tradition, but by opposition. For Lúcia, this environment strengthened the sense that the sacred and the secular world were in conflict, and that loyalty to God required vigilance and sacrifice. Years later, Lúcia would describe early spiritual experiences that she claimed occurred before the famous apparitions of 1917. According to her later writings, she experienced perceptions, sensations, and encounters that she interpreted as supernatural. These experiences were described as preparation, as a gradual introduction to what would later unfold. However, these accounts were not recorded at the time. They were written years later, under religious supervision, after the events of Fatima had already transformed her life completely. Memory is not static. It is shaped by time, expectation, repetition, and external influence. When experiences are revisited after becoming symbolically significant, they often acquire new meaning, structure, and coherence. This raises unavoidable questions. How do childhood memories change over time? To what extent are early experiences reinterpreted in light of later events? How much influence do authority figures, religious frameworks, and institutional expectations exert on personal recollection? At the time these early experiences were said to occur, none of the later attention existed. There were no journalists, no theologians, no investigators present. Lúcia was simply a child immersed in a symbolic universe where the supernatural was already part of everyday language and belief. The year 1916 passed quietly in official history, yet it would later be described by Lúcia as a turning point. According to her testimony, spiritual experiences intensified during this period, still private, still unobserved, still without public significance. These experiences would later be framed as preparation for what was to come. Everything would change in 1917. That year would permanently disrupt the routine of Aljustrel and transform Fatima into one of the most debated religious sites in the world. What had been an isolated village would become a focal point of global attention. Lúcia would no longer be simply a shepherd girl. She would become a witness, a narrator, and eventually the guardian of a story that would provoke devotion, skepticism, controversy, and debate across generations. The apparitions, reported in 1917, did not occur in a vacuum. They emerged from a specific psychological, cultural, and historical environment. They were shaped by fear, faith, political tension, and collective expectation. The reactions of the local population ranged from devotion to ridicule. Authorities intervened. The church hesitated. Investigations began. And at the center of it all stood a child whose voice carried extraordinary weight. A child whose words would be repeated, recorded, analyzed, and questioned for decades. A child who would eventually retreat into silence, convent life, and controlled communication, as her testimony became both sacred and dangerous. But before crowds gathered, before secrets were formulated, before institutional authority intervened, there existed only a childhood shaped by obedience, imagination, fear, devotion, and tradition. And it is precisely there that the most uncomfortable question of this entire story remains. Where does a child's lived experience end, and where does the construction of a symbol begin? This question does not seek to deny belief, nor to affirm it blindly. It seeks to understand how narratives are born, how they grow, and how they become untouchable. The story of Lúcia of Fatima is not only a religious story, it is a human story, one that forces us to confront memory, power, faith, and doubt. In the continuation of this series, we will enter 1917 in detail. We will examine the first reported apparitions, the reactions of families and authorities, the intervention of the state, the role of the church, and the gradual transformation of personal testimony into global religious narrative. If you want to continue this journey and explore the next chapters of this story, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to support the project and comment with your suggestions for future themes, historical figures, or spiritual narratives you would like to see explored.